Hello and welcome to Skipton Baptist Church Online. It's great to have you as we come to the end of our series. We've been looking at the book of Daniel. And over these last number of weeks, we've been looking at different flavors of faith, I suppose, as we've gone through Daniel's story. In the beginning, we looked at Daniel's intrinsic faith, a faith that shapes everything. And then there was the acoustic faith, a faith that listens in stereo to God and to culture to be able to translate God's message so that it can be heard. We had an elastic faith, a faith that is stretched but not broken between what God can do and what often happens. We have kenotic faith, which is a faith in weakness and in servitude, a poetic faith that embraces mystery with imagination and with creativity. We have an eccentric faith, a faith that is centered on a greater reality, a different reality than what the world is. And last week, Catherine shared with us about a panoramic faith, which is needed to capture sight of God's big plan, to live in the light of that plan. And that was in chapter 7, we looked at that. And today we're going to be focusing on chapter 12 particularly, but I want to have a look at the intervening chapters very briefly to give us a context and a complete picture of Daniel. As I said, Catherine looked at the panoramic faith last week, a faith which catches sight of the whole picture of history and eternity, which we can only have a snapshot of, hints of its fullness through our place in time and our knowledge of history and the glimpses of the future promise that God gives his people, often in mysterious, enigmatic and confusing ways in Scripture. You see, the thing is, apocalyptic writings like here in Daniel and in Revelation is capturing not a one-off event, but a pattern of behavior in humanity, one which is enacted in different ways in humanity's story, both globally and sometimes even interpersonally. Because these are patterns of behavior which are based on the attitudes of the human heart, the warped, sin-damaged heart and soul. And that's why so often history repeats itself. When we live according to the means and the ways of the world repeat themselves often. And so we have a pattern which can be seen throughout human history and is seen here in the actions of certain kingdoms in the 500 plus years or so before Jesus and after Daniel. In Daniel 8, which is echoed in Daniel's chapter 10 to 12, there are distinct parallels and fulfillments in the persons of the kings of Persia, which were overcome by Greece, that's in Alexander the Great. And after his death, 4 lesser kings spread up, or 4 lesser horns, as the picture portrays. And these are his generals, Alexander's generals, Seleucus, Ptolemy, Lysimachus, and Cassander. And they have different interactions with each other, but eventually, in the Seleucid part of the kingdom, a really nasty king sets himself up, a guy called Antiochus IV Epiphanes. And in his area, he ruled Jerusalem. And in his reign, he desecrated the temple in the AD 160s, the temple which had been rebuilt by Haggai when the people returned from exile. And he set up a pagan idol in the heart of the temple, and he sacrificed pigs and desecrated the temple. And the story of his overthrow and the miraculous cleansing of the temple is read in a book called Maccabees, and is commemorated every year in the Jewish festival of Hanukkah. But in the middle of chapter 8 and chapter 10 and 12, we have chapter 9, which is where Daniel prays to God and repents of his and the people's sin and asks, how long will it be until we're free? He actually says he's been reading Jeremiah's prophecies. That's Jeremiah 25, where the promise was they'd be in exile for 70 years, which actually the people of Judah were, and they returned under Cyrus's decree. That's the story of Nehemiah and Ezra. And they are told, Daniel is told, that they would, because of their disobedience, be in oppressed situation for another 490 years. Now, I may be pushing it a little bit, but if Daniel had this prophecy around the 500s BC, that the 70 years would last for another 7 times that, around 490, that brings us pretty close to some fairly significant historical events half a millennia later, namely the birth, life, death, and resurrection of a certain Jesus of Nazareth, during whose life he spoke of another time when the temple would be destroyed, which it was in AD 70 by the Roman general Titus. because these patterns repeat again and again in history. They happen in the history of the Near Middle East, but also they cast a light into our future too. And what we can see is what Catherine warned last week. If it's dangerous to start looking ahead of time to see who represents what beast. In fact, I figure that we can only really know who these beasts are in retrospect. So alongside the pattern which seems to repeat in human powers, there is also in Daniel and in apocalyptic writings a promise. The promise which says God will overcome the beasts of human pride and power. So Daniel is privileged to have been at a real interesting point of history, of historic upheaval in the region of the Near Middle East. He lived through turmoil, political upheaval. He was privileged to see the pattern of human history, which was personified in these kings over hundreds of years. But he also saw a new kingdom, the kingdom of the rock that would smash the statue of the empires, the Ancient of Days and the coming of the Son of Man, the kingdom which is inaugurated by Jesus and which will be brought to fulfillment one day in his glory. And so we arrive at Daniel chapter 12, and we're going to particularly focus on the second part of it. Daniel asks the angel who's giving him these visions, when will all these astonishing things happen and what will be the outcome of them? And I guess they're the sort of questions that we ask in regard to these prophetic and apocalyptic writings in Daniel, Revelation, and other places. And in response to that question, the angel's answer is brilliant and terribly frustrating. He says the words of these prophecies are sealed up until the end of time, until the end of the Persia, Greece, Rome, the Old Covenant, all of the above, until they are needed. And instead of answering Daniel, the angel just tells him this. He says, go on your way, get on with your life, go and live. And so I want to ask about this challenge about going and living. How many experiences have you had in your life of God in a really clear, big and abundant way? I often feel a bit inferior compared to the saints of old and heroes of faith who seem to have these kind of amazing experiences all the time. But it's interesting to note that Daniel, in his whole life, which covered at least 3 major rulers in Babylon, well over 80 years, had only a handful of significant events recorded in this book. Okay, they are pretty seriously significant. But out of those 80 plus years, the majority of Daniel's life was lived in global obscurity, without recorded special or significant events. Daniel, like the majority of us, and actually most people in the Bible, lived most of his life in the unknown, the obscurity, in mundanity. In fact, if we look at our readings that we're looking at, Daniel chapter 12, after such tremendous feats of God and of faith, huge revelations of the future of humanity and of the people, the angel just gives Daniel his greatest calling. Go on your way, get on with your life, go and live. It sounds a bit like retirement, doesn't it? Well, I don't think so. As mentioned a couple of weeks ago, there is no shelf life for a disciple of Jesus, no retirement plan as a follower of Christ. In fact, I think those words from the angel, go on your way, get on with your life, go and live, captures the high call placed on Daniel and a high call that is placed on us. It's the calling that each of us has and quite possibly never occurs to us. And it's maybe our greatest and actually most challenging call. Go and live everyday life. And all those other ick types of faith that we've looked at are pretty much useless unless we take on the theme of this morning, which is everyday faith. And for those who need it tidied up, maybe it's everyday ick faith. Daniel, it is a call to live that everyday life. And with that in mind, I want to draw out a few things from Daniel's life about how to live in the everyday. Because the more I've thought about it, the more it's a really imprecise answer. But I think it's the biggest and most significant quandary that all of us Christians face today. And it's a question and a challenge Jesus was totally aware of. We read about it in John chapter 17 in his what's called a high priestly prayer when Jesus is praying for his followers. And he prays, I've given them your word and the world has hated them. For they're not of the world any more than I am of the world. And that phrase, in the world, but not of the world, it's a well-worn phrase. It's one that we've looked at over this series. It's what's been behind many of our reflections. But what does it actually mean? How do we do it? That phrase, in the world, but not of the world, has often been interpreted in a very narrow kind of way, as being separate, as being apart. It's been emphasizing the difference, which has often led to hostility, judgment, and distance. Perhaps we've been too conscious of emphasizing and almost demonizing the difference between ourselves and those who do not follow Jesus. A real and tangible us and them, inside here and outside there. It's in our language, isn't it? Both consciously and maybe even accidentally. And maybe this is why there's sometimes a negative reaction, or at least suspicion, of the Christian message and the church in general. Because the church historically has often failed to dignify or sanctify the ordinary, the human, the everyday. We see it in church history. We see it in some of the early church heresies, where everything that was kind of in the natural world, everything that was physical was seen to be sinful, and only the spiritual was important. We see it in some of the monastic movements where they tried to withdraw from society. We see it in Adrian Plass's book, The Sacred Diary, where he has a couple of really hyper-spiritual people who talk about others in the terms of living in the natural. If we take this view of an us and them, spiritual and unspiritual, we miss something really important, that God values humanity. This is what the incarnation of Jesus is all about. It's why Jesus came and lived among us for those 30 years or so. It wasn't to show us how to be good church-going Christians. It wasn't only to die on the cross, vital and desperately needed, that all humanity needs and we need. But it was also to demonstrate what it really means to be human, the prime example of to living a human life. The 16th century scholar Erasmus wrote in his book, The Epicurean, spoke about Epicureans as those who are enjoy life. And he says, if the name bothers us, no one better deserves the name Epicurean than the revered founder and head of Christianity, Christ. Completely mistaken, therefore, he writes, are those who talk in their foolish fashion about Christ having been sad and gloomy in character and calling us to follow a dismal mode of life. On the contrary, he alone shows the most enjoyable life of all and the one most full of true pleasure. I remember watching in the early 80s, the series Jesus of Nazareth with Robert Powell depicting Jesus. I've spoken about this before, and I came away from that thinking Jesus was really sad and miserable, a true man of sorrows all the time. And more recently, we've got a more balanced approach with series like the Bible mini-series and the Lumo series, and also The Chosen, where the actor there, Jonathan Rumi, portrays Jesus more fully, both happy and sad, joyous, and also in mourning. Jesus wants us to live the full life. That's what he says in John 10:10. The thief comes to steal, kill, and destroy. I've come that they may have life, and life to the full. That's what he came to give us, to bring our humanity to a place of fulfillment. We used to own a Land Rover Discovery 4x4, and I loved that car. We had it for many years. It was great for those long journeys. We could fit the whole family in one trip. It transported stuff, often carrying SBC equipment and borrowed staging and everything. And one time when I owned it, me and a couple of friends went on an off-road experience, which meant we went to this kind of off-road country park, and we used their 4x4 Land Rovers, and it was a great experience, hanging off slopes, steep crevices, fording deep rivers. And I got back at the end of it, got back into my trusty Discovery and started driving home on those smooth tarmac roads, and it occurred to me that my Discovery lived a pretty unfulfilled life compared to what it was made for. Could the same be said for us, for those in our world even, living an unfulfilled, insignificant life? Because Jesus came to redeem, to reclaim, and to rewrite what it means to be human, because it has been damaged. The aim of humanity, so often the goals and the values that society live by in some way are about a pursuit of the following things: pursuit of power, of pleasure, of payment, of position and prestige, of pride, and sometimes even the pain of others. And this is what a successful life can sometimes look like. And it looks good. It looks like the lovely Angelina Jolie. But something isn't right in this picture, is it? Something's not quite right. And so if we turn it around, because it's upside down, we turn it around and we see that even when it's turned around, things are not right. This is called the Thatcher effect. For a long, interesting story. When you turn it the right way round, it's then you see the distortion. You see how it's not right. And that's what Jesus did. He turns things the right way up. And in Jesus showing us how things should look, it brings into focus and clarity just how off the mark even the best of us can so often be. And our call to live that everyday life with an everyday faith, it's called to live it the right way up, as Jesus demonstrated. That's one of the key reasons why we often talk about being like Jesus. It's more than just an aspirational being a nice person. It's a redefinition of what it means to be and to act human. Because something I see, and I've seen in my own life and in others, that it's too easy to judge, to critique, and even condemn the lifestyles and choices others make. And Christians, sadly, often negatively, have a reputation of judging others less holy than them. And the alternative way, the way which I see is more Jesus, and the way which I think is demonstrated by Daniel, particularly in chapter 1, it's more obvious, is that to live God's way, to live the Jesus way, that can automatically challenge, critique, and even condemn the actions and attitudes of others who are living in an un-Jesus way of life. It's then that their lives, their choices are actually between them and God, their conscience and God's Holy Spirit, as the life, the right way up example of Jesus is displayed in us. They can see the difference. And people can see that difference, and it causes them to wonder why. I think this is seen most explicitly at Christian funerals. We've done a number of funerals over this past couple of months, and there's been a mixture of those who've had a deep faith in Jesus and those who don't have a living faith in Jesus. And there is such a profound and tangible difference. There is, for those who know Jesus, there is hope rather than despair. Yes, of course, there's grief and there's sorrow, but there's also joy and celebration. A number of times I've had people who are undertakers or others who come along and say, I'm not a churchgoer, but that was so uplifting at a funeral. You see, everyday life, lived the way God intends, living in this world but not of it, is what makes a difference. God values our everyday aspects of life, its cares, its concerns, its joys and pleasures, its questions and its challenges, its struggles and its uncertainties. It's why we can pray about our concerns, because God is concerned about those seemingly trivial things at times. And we need an everyday faith in order to do this. But what do we mean by that? Well, we maybe know that in Hebrews 11, faith is defined as being sure of what we hope for and certain of what we do not see. So seeing the world and humanity and life as God intends it to be, it requires faith, because it's not normal. It's not in our everyday living. We need faith to see it, to imagine it, to dream it, to faith it into reality in the here and now, making what is invisible to this world's vision obvious and clear with HD 5K Technicolor surround sound of how things are meant to be. And this is to be seen in our lives and in the way we relate to one another. It's actually the call of the disciple, not merely to quote scripture at will, to know all the books of the Bible, the 39 articles of faith, the call to mind every Hillsong lyric, but to live life in the manner of the Master. But how do we do that? I want to suggest just 3 ways in Daniel's life that can inform us and help us work out how to address this question of being in the world, not of the world. How can we live to be more fully human? And the first one is, maybe unsurprisingly, is about prayer. Now, this is much more than just the action or activity of prayer, much more than a religious observance or practice. Daniel's life was saturated with God. Think about a sponge. When you put a sponge into water, it soaks up all the water and you bring it out, and when it is squeezed, it's then when the water comes out. Because of the way Daniel lived, his honesty, his integrity, it led to him being called upon when people needed him. Whenever he was squeezed, it was God that came out. The only reason he could constantly keep living the way he did and respond to the maybe infrequent yet mega challenges was because he was saturated with God. And like Daniel, we are living in a form of exile. The church, once having a voice, has less so. Moved from majority to minority, the center to the margins, from Jerusalem to Babylon, with our support structures removed. Can we still stand on our own 2 faith feet? Or are we so dependent on the props of the church that we've forgotten how to worship and follow Jesus alone? So the question is, how does your relationship with God really affect and impact your 24/7, whatever that might be? Faith, is it your hobby or is it your heart? What's your saturation level with God, and what pours out of us when we're squeezed? Daniel was saturated because of his life of prayer. The second thing is to know your no-go zones. That's what Daniel did. The whole aim of the Babylonian enterprise with taking the people from Judah and bringing them in exile was to assimilate them and Daniel, his fellow Jews, into their customs, language, practices, to dilute their own ones. And Daniel, throughout his life in Babylon, obviously must have taken on some practices of the Babylonians, definitely their language, their dress, their vegetables, and perhaps even taking on their Babylonian names. But there were certain lines he refused to cross: eating tainted food, bowing down to idols, and abandoning praying to God. And for us in our exile, we need to know where our no-go zones are and why. There are some pretty clear scriptural ones. Murder isn't really encouraged, for example. But there are a huge number of grey areas, ones which are often left to our consciences, our situations, and to the guiding of the Holy Spirit. And people have different ones. Growing up in Northern Ireland, in the culture I was in, I was convinced that all Christians didn't drink alcohol. And I was shocked the first time I noticed that Christians did, and realised that was only part of my upbringing. It wasn't part of scriptural teaching. I had a friend called Ken, an American who moved from the States over to Britain, and he was from a fairly strict background in the States. And so whenever people from back home would phone him and say, "What are you getting up to?" he wouldn't tell them about trips to the cinema or to the theatre, because that just wasn't done. There are lots of things we can presume Christians don't do. They're no-go zones, what they should be. Certain swear words, smoking, drinking, watching certain movies, reading certain books. You see, our no-go zones are very much linked to our weaknesses and areas of temptation. My no-go zones may be different to yours and the other way round, and we should look at those without judgment. Remember, Jesus crossed an awful lot of religious people's no-go zones in order to reach the lost. You see, how we live our lives is noticed. I had a friend called Richard who was a school friend. We used to hang out, a group of us guys, and most of us were Christians at the time. Richard wasn't. But then at some point he became a Christian, and we didn't really know how or why. And I remember one day walking home with him through a park, and I asked Richard, I said, "Richard, why did you become a Christian?" And his response was essentially, "Because I've been watching you guys." He'd been watching us and saw something so different that he independently had gone and found out about Jesus and committed his life to Christ. That's amazing, isn't it? But there's a warning too. I've had situations, even in these past 20 plus years at SBC, where I've known of one or two people who have actually left the church fellowship because of what they perceived as Christian hypocrisy. And even with one or two, I know they've still not returned to church. So the question is, what are your no-go zones? And ask, why do you have them? Are they for scriptural reasons, cultural, traditional, personal? And how might those no-go zones affect your relating to other people and expressing the good news of Jesus? The third thing that Daniel says, he had prayer, he had no-go zones, but he also just got on with it. In spite of having those no-go zone, non-negotiable areas, he still managed to live out his faith, doing well at his work, serving with distinction and note, acquiring a reputation for reliability and wisdom in the very heart of Babylonian power and culture, whilst maintaining his integrity and identity. I think it's great that at the beginning his name is Daniel and he's given the name Belteshazzar. And then by the time it gets to Belshazzar's reign, the queen at the time recommends a man called Daniel, who is also called Belteshazzar. He almost reclaimed his name as he got on in living in Babylon, because he got on with his everyday life, saturated with God, yet maintaining his boundaries and still being part of the core society in Babylon. A person of God as a person of influence at the very heart of power. With this in mind, it draws my attention and my thoughts to those who are followers of Jesus in politics, in authority. And we've got friends, haven't we, in the church who are involved in politics at different levels. And I'm not talking about Christians in your particular brand of politics. Across the political spectrum, there are those who are following Jesus. And we should be praying for them, finding out about them, even encouraging them, perhaps even considering, do we have a part to play, regardless of political affiliation, in being Jesus's influence in those areas. You see, Daniel was known. It's why he was accessible when the need came. It's why he was trusted at the highest levels of the palace by at least 3 successive monarchs. He made an impact with the way he lived his life and who he was. I love it whenever I've been in situations where I've been introduced to people in unexpected situations, like I was at a corporate event with a friend. Once I was at a stag do, I was in a nightclub even, and I introduced myself at some point as a Baptist minister. It's really funny seeing people's responses. They don't know how to handle it. But it's about being who you are in those situations and acting with a way that makes integrity and honesty and seeing authenticity there, but also demonstrating life in its full. There's a guy called Vic Jacobson, who frequently, a Christian evangelical minister, who goes to the summer solstice and represents Jesus there in front of lots of people who are there to worship the sunrise. A guy called John Drain and his wife go to psychic fairs as Christian evangelicals, setting up a stall, speaking to people who are desperately searching for something spiritual. And they're there, being Jesus's followers in some of the most strangest places. Churches who have buses which go around and give out hot drinks and conversations to prostitutes and drug addicts on the streets of major UK cities. Why do they do that? In order to be different, to tell people, to redeem their humanity and say that nowhere in this life is off limits to a God who will go anywhere to find his lost child and to tell them that they are welcome home and that there's a better way to live. Gerard Kelly, who wrote the book Stretch, which we've based our themes upon, writes this: people will not listen to you unless you are somehow the same as them, but they will have nothing to listen to if you're not somehow different. Gone are the days of the effective street preaching message of turn or burn. It carries no fear when people have no concept of God, sin, judgment, or hell. People are interested less in the proofs and arguments. There still are, but they also want to know, does this work? What difference does this make? Does it help me make sense of what we're increasingly realizing is an upside down, topsy-turvy world in which we are part of? There are so many lifestyle gurus out there today who display their lives instatastically on social media, perfect organization, perfect abs and makeup, proclaiming that you could live my life. Many are looking for a fulfilling life, and the full life seems to be presented by these experts and influencers on 21st century life. But they're looking for followers, because more followers equals more income. And so often their lives are not real. They've got curated images. So the question is, who are you following? Who is your lifestyle guru? Because genuinely, I want to follow Christ. My friends, that's not a pious statement. It's a confession of I know no other better. It reminds me of Peter's response when Jesus does a whole pile of really tough teaching, and lots of people, lots of his followers turn back, and Jesus says to his friends, do you want to leave too? And Peter says, Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life. Jesus is the real deal. It returns to the idea of this living life the right way up. It's about a life where there is joy, hope, purpose, a life of creativity, humor, of wine and of struggles, a life which doesn't hide from the times that our faith is stretched, a life which listens to the questions people are asking and shares our own, a life of serving others, being prepared to be different, a life which sees God and his plan and his kingdom and his love at the very center, a life in all its fullness. So the question is, does it make a difference? Does your everyday life, your everyday faith make a difference? And is it noticeable? This call is a call for all of us, a call to live the right way up. The different elements of faith covered over these last weeks are ways of following God in exile, helping to transform the ordinary with an everyday faith. We've picked up from a number of people how much they've both enjoyed and been challenged by this series on Daniel. Familiar stories, pretty fantastical ones, miraculous ones, yet ones rooted in established, provable historical events and people. Daniel, a ruler from the tribe of Judah, one of their first exiles to be taken to Babylon, attempted indoctrination and assimilation into their pagan culture, lived a life distinct enough to influence those around him, who spoke to and stood up to and advised the most powerful rulers of his day and area, and potentially influenced generations of magi and wise men. But he was only ever able to be in these situations, to face them, manage them, survive and thrive beyond them because of his everyday faith, rooted in prayer and saturated in God, knowing his identity in the areas that he would not go to, and living the life in obscurity to the God and for the God who is and made him to be who he was. To live faithfully in obscurity, to walk in the manner of the Master, to live the right way up in an upside down world. That is the challenge for Daniel and the challenge for us in our everyday life.